I began by being educated by my father. He was a teacher, I was his son, and I was a bright boy. And he taught me to sit for the exhibitioner's exam. When I sat for it as a small boy, I had 4 chances. At my first chance, he didn't pay too much attention. He just brought me for the experience. But I turned out to win the 7th place, and I learned afterwards I really had won a place. But people said he's very young. Put him in at number 7. Will you come in next time? And I did next time I came first. I was a bright boy, very bright. And I went to the Queen's Royal College having won the exhibition. And there I was supposed to pay attention to my work and win a scholarship and go away and be a lawyer or a doctor and come back and be a distinguished black citizen and be recommended to be a member of the Legislative Council, all of which I carefully did not do. I went to Queen's Royal College and it was a great disappointment because the chief thing that excited me about college was there were lots of books around and I was a great reader and could play cricket. So I spent the 7 years of college, 1911 to 1918, reading books and playing cricket. And I must say, those were very important years to me because my life on the whole has been spent to a substantial degree in writing books, in writing about books, and if not a very distinguished reader in writing about it. I'm one of the best known writers on cricket there has been in the 20th century. So that those years from 1911 to 1918 in which I sort of rejected my work for scholarship, I played cricket and it brought some results.
I first experienced CLR games at 15 years old, 1970. Trinidad was in the midst of the Black Power cultural resurgence, a time in which you started to question your place in the world. In August 1960, CLR James gave 5 lectures to the public in Trinidad when he was working with Williams and the PNM as the editor of The Nation, the PNM newspaper. In 1970, I read those 5 lectures, and that commenced my journey in sociology. Because in 1970, I was seeking out explanations for the nature of our social order, and especially race relations. But in the 1960 lectures, what I got from it is that CLR in 1960, August of 1960, in those 5 lectures, was presenting to the audience in Trinidad a historical materialist interpretation of the world. It was not orthodox historical materialism, but it was historical materialism in the way that James defined it. But what struck me as I read it at age 15 is that his historical materialism was essentially white. In those 5 lectures, he gave an interpretation of the world that was essentially North Atlantic hegemony. He mentioned Nkrumah and Ghanaian independence, etc., but in 6 lines in passing. And he gave us the classic orthodox racist North Atlantic view on the world, democracy starting with Aristotle and Athens, and he moved us through Rome, and then he took us to the Levelers and the English Civil War, the French Revolution, Rousseau, and it was succinctly and potently Eurocentric. And he ended the lecture with the Cold War. that was the 5 lectures. So that left me in a state of questioning. The next experience I had with CLR is that when I read Party Politics in the West Indies, 1962 he published it. And what struck me about Party Politics in the West Indies was his chapter on the middle class in the West Indies. But it was apparent that he was speaking about Trinidad and Tobago, especially Trinidad, and he was speaking about middle class nationalist politics a la Williams and the PNM. And it is the most potent analysis I have read, barring Fanor's Wretched of the Earth, on the nature of the middle class and middle class politics. James literally exposed the salient weaknesses of this entity called the Caribbean middle class politicians. But James only spoke about Afro middle class politicians. The entire work was silent on the issue of the position and role of the Indo-Trinbagonians. And that was a glaring omission in the work. But the question that arose after I read about Party Politics in the West Indies, the question that arose in my mind is, what next? You have exposed succinctly the inherent organic weakness of the African middle class in the Caribbean, the African middle class politician in the Caribbean. You have succinctly shown us, potently shown us, where the commanding heights of the mode of production is still dominated by multinational and local whites. You have shown that there is still a correlation between power and skin color. The fact that the Afro middle class has no footing in production. They are simply political managers. But then when you speak of Trinidad and Tobago politics, there is that missing dimension that James still had to tackle for me, and that is the issue of race relations. But whilst I am reading government and politics in the party politics in the West Indies, James is giving me his historical materialism. He is insisting to me that the working class is the vanguard class, and elements of a vanguard party will emerge out of this working class. He speaks about Mighty Sparrow, the Calypsonian, and I'm following James and I'm going. And then you recognize that James now is trapped by his historical materialism. And that is what then forced me out of James to ask the fundamental question that has underpinned my work up to today is, what is wrong with historical materialism? What is wrong with it that James could not come to grips? So James is insisting to me that there is a vanguard class and a vanguard party that will arise. James is insisting out of his historical materialism that we have to look towards the working class. And then James is expelled from Trinidad, confined to his house, and booted out by Williams. And Williams then raises the specter in 1965 of communist subversion in Trinidad and Tobago as a means for him to purge. And this is a move by Williams that is called for by the British, because the British were always paranoid about communist subversion in Trinidad and Tobago vis-a-vis the oil resources. So then I meet James now in my later life. I meet James in a little booklet he wrote leading up to the 1966 general elections, what he calls East Indians of West Indians descent. James, for the first time that I have experienced, James is now attempting to understand race relations in Trinidad and Tobago through historical materialism. And it is in this little booklet that James finally reveals to me the nature of his historical materialism. And in fact, it is when I am reading Horkheimer, to me, founding icon of the Frankfurt School, people don't talk much about him. But when I am reading Horkheimer, it suddenly dawns on me that Horkheimer and James have a very similar historical materialism. Very similar. I don't know if they knew each other. I've never researched that. But what strikes me is that Horkheimer and James, their ontology is so similar. This is not a full James, because I don't need to affirm James through Horkheimer. I'm just showing the flow of the historical materialism as it developed outside of Russia and Europe and how it washed over the world. Now, while reading East Indians of West Indian descent, I discovered James's ontology. James believes in the whole, as Horkheimer did. James believes in a social order that is a whole. It is complete. It has all the necessary inputs in which to regenerate, to carry itself forward in history, because I subsequently discovered that James believes in the Enlightenment project of scientific rationalism and progress. James went to his grave never questioning the Enlightenment. And that is where James and myself part.
Yes, I think somebody else we interviewed made a similar point about the links between James and the Frankfurt School. And he also made this link that you are establishing now between James and the Enlightenment. The verdict that he passed on to Saint Louverture was that he did not suffer a personal failure, that his failure was a failure of the Enlightenment. You think your argument that James was Eurocentric can also be brought to bear on the reading of the Black Jacobins?
You see, the problem with James is that I cannot sum him up as being, as we said in 1970, a black-skinned blue-eyed boy or Afro-Saxon. You see, James was so intense a thinker that when I read James in analyzing Trinidad in 1966, it's entirely different from his analysis of Louverture. Now, in 1966, and this started from party politics in the West Indies since 62, James believed that there was a pathway that the Caribbean can take that would lead to development and progress. James believed it. You saw it, and when James was condemning the middle class, James was insisting that historical materialism is the methodology by which we would gain progress, development, and we would move out of the backwardness that imperialism had subjected us to. And in East Indians of West Indian, he stated openly that the backwardness that imperialism had imposed upon us, he made it clear that it was this wholeness, this cultural entity that would draw everybody into and create this unified whole that would carry us forward. James believed that, and he wanted to believe it, and he had to believe it, because he could not see that with independence we flounder. So at other times he would see it. So when he was analyzing Nkrumah, he could be critical. James was, for example, very critical of Chelly Jagan because of Jagan's doctrinaire historical materialism. But James himself, as an individual, had to believe that there was a mechanism in existence that would carry us out of the backwardness of imperialism, and his was his historical materialism. That didn't mean that he was unable to see.
Okay, you were saying that James's belief in the Enlightenment is reflected in his historical materialism.
Yeah. Now I wanted to qualify that.
Okay.
James accepted the Enlightenment, but it was an Enlightenment that was defined by historical materialism. So, for example, I tell Marx and Engels created the extreme left wing of the Enlightenment. Marx and Engels' Enlightenment was entirely different from that of Robespierre. James was in that vein. Because remember, capitalism is part of the Enlightenment. James divides the Enlightenment into the Enlightenment of historical materialism, keeping progress and scientific rationalism, rejecting capitalism. Now that is, if you are capitalist, James rejects that. But as long as you have the Enlightenment of historical materialism, which is grounded in progress and scientific rationalism, James is there. Now, when I read Black Jacobins, what I subsequently discovered over the years is that James's affirmation of l'ouverture, I had to question the rationale for James's affirmation of l'ouverture, because the Haitian Revolution was so complex that l'ouverture in himself was not a revolution. It was so diverse. And my position today in my old days is that James's affirmation of l'ouverture is because James insists that l'ouverture was a personality entirely different from like Dessalines. So Dessalines was a type of brute, uncultured, violent, whereas l'ouverture was an African that had walked two roads. Now, personally, I look upon that sort of analysis of Haiti. I read it up to today, where certain authors insist that Haiti has an African base, which is voodoo, and things not white and things not European, versus people like l'ouverture and the mulattoes. So what has happened, the lesson from Black Jacobins that I continue to hold on to, is the fact that James, in that work, was able to point to his ability to take theoretical origins that he gleaned from Marx in Capital Volume 1 and apply it to the economic analysis of slavery, sugar, revolution, and eventually Williams will stretch it into English abolition of enslavement. And in Black Jacobins, that is what I've held on to, the fact that James taught me how to take these very simple theoretical foundations laid by others and to extrapolate it into your own reality in an attempt to understand your own reality. And that reality was why enslavement and why sugar. As to James's explanation of the dynamics of the Haitian Revolution, I continue to insist that it is too low centered. But the fact of the matter is it is a major work on the Haitian Revolution in English. Before James, the major works were in French. So maybe we have to bear with him on that and not treat him harshly.
Interesting. Interesting view, because there is also an observation that even after l'ouverture was eliminated, that Dessalines did not go on to be a brute, that he forgave many of the whites and did not, and James saw that as an African tradition, that African people are more forgiving and less vengeful. Do you think that's legitimate today?
You see, that is the straitjacket they continue to paint Haiti in up to today.
Okay.
Now, we have to see that dynamic in Desailly himself. Now, if you want to believe that because Desailly was not a Oreo, therefore he had a propensity to barbarity, then you will look for that and say, oh, well, you know, he didn't prove to be. What I see Desailly is a different reality. I see Desailly in rebellion against a system that was so brutal, physically and emotionally, that he denied him his humanity. What then does he use, and we go back now, what then is his worldview of rebellion and revolution? And what Desailly had was what he brought with him here. And what he had, therefore, was a worldview that was entirely different to Louverture's. Some people insist that with Desailly, Haiti then became socially and economically, right, an outpost of West Africa and West Indies. Because what they insisted is that with the victory of the revolution and Desailly's rule, West Africans proceeded then to turn Haiti into what they brought with them here. So what people insist in their travel diaries, that in the post-revolution stage, is that Haiti became, in fact, West Africa in Caribbean. And my position is it is still today. It is more West Africa than Western. That is the problem they have with Haiti.
So in that sense, maybe James shouldn't have called it the Black Jacobins. He should have called it the Caribbean West Africans.
Thank you. Because you see, Black Jacobins insist that the discourse for rebellion came from the French Revolution with the Jacobins. What my position is that revolution was based upon what you brought with here, and what you brought with here was your West African worldview that was tempered and changed by your realities on the plantation.
That's an interesting interpretation, and I think we may take that argument further by looking at Beyond the Boundary, where James makes a claim that cricket helped in civilizing the Caribbean by making them more willing to not brag, but to commend even the losers for a good effort in a game. Unlike, say, the Americans in baseball, where they would scream and fight each other over a game.
Yeah.
But is that a credit to cricket, or is it a credit to the traditional background of Caribbean people?
I have never read Beyond the Boundary.
Okay.
I have heard everybody. I listened to James
Yes.
when he visited UWI, I think it was in 1976.
Okay, 86.
You know, he came, I think it was 76, he
Okay.
came from Jamaica.
Okay.
Because I think he attended Manley's PNPs.
All right.
And what happened, I listened to him in the auditorium talk on speak of Beyond the Boundary. And the fundamental question I have up to today in my old days is, if cricket was so fundamental, what has happened to our cricket today?
Yeah.
When all cricket, in many cases, cricket in that immediate pre- and post-colonial era, you needed to live. You needed to survive. You needed employment. And excelling on the field was one means to get into English county cricket to live. But my position on James is that James's whiteness was in many cases, to me, intolerable. There were times when I heard James speaking of Shakespeare and Proust, and I would say to myself, have we not literateurs from the non-white world? It's only white people create literature. All of us in the non-white world have had our traditions, of oral and written. All James spoke about. But my position later on in life was that James specialized in that because he needed to live, because he was a hustler. Because remember, one thing I would like to say, remember, James's politics excluded him from a space in post-colonial Trinidad and Tobago. James's Marxism marked him for death. There was no space for James in Trinidad and Tobago in the post-colonial era. So that means James remained an exile, roaming the white world. And he had to hone skills that white people would pay to hear.
One would argue with Edward Said that being on the margins of society, being an exile, is essentially the role of the intellectual. I do not completely buy that because I would like to see the exile intellectual return home someday. But Said had no home to return in Palestine, so maybe his was a unique situation. But in the case of James and his Marxism, can we safely say that Europeans actually admired him for his Marxism?
No.
Or Americans for that matter, so...
You see, he lived a life of hardship. He lived a life by having to live off of small groups, never mainstream. There was no room for him. James, by his historical materialism, he cut himself off from Russia, China, Vietnam, and Cuba. He had nothing left.
Okay.
James couldn't make it to Ceausescu.
No.
So James, by
So his
this,
Trotskyism?
yes, but I don't even know if it's Trotskyism because when
He
I
broke
read
with Trotsky.
Yes, he broke with Trotsky.
Yeah. 1938?
Yes, when I read James in the 1960 lectures, he was not a Trotskyite
No.
at all.
Yeah, that's the notes on dialectic. That's where he
Yeah, that's where
outlined his disagreement with Trotsky.
So James could not make it home because of his Marxism. He could not live in exile like others in formerly socialist states because he also broke with them. So James was a gentleman with testicular fortitude because he never surrendered.
No.
He never surrendered. So he could have done what was needed and toe the line and go and live in exile in East Ojoade or something. James refused, and poor fella, he lived in the ghetto, he lived hand to mouth. When you meet James personally, you saw from his clothes and things that he was living a very hard life. And that's what I admire him for, is that he never compromised his beliefs for the sake of living off the fat of the land. But his Marxism alienated him from the Caribbean because the British made sure that he was hunted.
Okay, so do you think his distance from Moscow, from Havana, from Beijing were attempts to play it safe even while remaining true to his principles?
From what I read from him, he had potent criticisms of all of them.
Yes.
Potent criticisms.
Yes.
It was not for the sake of living. When he articulated his criticisms of people, always talk about his criticisms of Russia, but they do not talk about his criticisms of China.
Yes, but where is his criticism of Britain and America?
None at all.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering at. He celebrated Athens. He celebrated Hegel of all people.
Yes.
He celebrated America, the American civilization, and there is something to celebrate in all these civilizations, but there is still also a lot to be critical about. I'm wondering about his choice to focus his criticism on the Soviet Union in the era of imperialism, when the critique should have been more prioritized, say, against British capitalism, as Marx would have done, or American imperialism at the time he was writing. But I think he was playing it safe to save his neck by not critiquing these other civilizations and focusing almost exclusively on Stalinism, which had a lot to be critiqued. But I don't think he was the priority of a historical materialist at the time that he was writing. I don't understand it. Why did he do that? You think it's because of his whiteness? Afro-Saxonism?
James is an enigma. He's dead and gone and he remains an enigma. Now, James would critique, for somebody who went through the historical materialist phase in my life, I also had a fixation with critiquing Russia. And it came out of a position that you had betrayed the revolution.
Okay, if you critique Russia?
Yes, because Russia had betrayed the revolution.
Yes, okay.
But on the other hand, James always gives you the indication of his whiteness. And you forgive him, but you see, then I can't forgive him at times because whilst James was writing party politics in the West Indies, Fano had written Richard of David. And when I got into Fano, that's when I left James, because of Fano. Fano walked away from James. Fano was in the door because of James's limitation.